Hello, chat. Hello, everyone from the Stellar Jockeys Discord and the Firelock section. Hello, everyone from my community. Today, I am joined by Infantry himself. We have done a bunch of behind the scenes work to set up the stream and everything like that. So I'm gonna give a quick little preamble blurb, basically, just saying that. Let me pause the alerts as well. Sorry. Just a quick little preamble blurb that some of you know that I played Firelock for a long time in a bastardized version. You'll be happy to know I don't play it in quite so bastardized a version anymore, or at least I try not to. In other words, another way to put that is yes. Some of you asked. I did eventually learn how to read. As recently as the day before yesterday, I played a game of Firelock where I was the 32nd man because I got my entire Regalic army killed in 30 seconds. And, rushed my tactical node forward and he got comp sniped because I'm shit at the game and I'm cringe. But I really enjoy Firelock. And I am happy to have Rifleinfantry here in the call with me. Go ahead and say hello, Rifleinfantry. Feel free to introduce yourself however you would like.
Howdy, howdy. Hey, I'm Rifleinfantry. I'm the guy that made Firelock, lead developer along with my collaborators, the Dreckfort. Thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to be here today.
It's true. I am very excited to have you. I gave for transparency's sake, chat. I gave him a list of interview questions that I would like to talk about. The first one being, I think a good starting point for the interview as well as for something people have probably been curious about is how did Firelock come to be? How did it come together? Where did it start? What's the story behind this at this point now? 5-book deep. 2 more on the way. 1.0 release coming out soon. This war game that is large, man. Bigger than some quote unquote released war games that I've played.
So, if you're the kind of person that plays and enjoys and talks about Firelock, I'm willing to bet that 1 in 4 of you has some kind of world building on the back burner. The dime a dozen Twitter project where you're drawing some characters and you have a cool little story, or just aesthetics that you like that you're putting to paper that are totally disconnected and don't really have any deeper presentation or interconnection yet. Firelock started as just this for me. It was a bunch of stuff that I like to draw. Black Powder Musketeers, Werewolves, 80s tactical kit, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't really have anything deeper to it. There wasn't a world, there wasn't any set of mechanics. Over time, I kind of became dissatisfied with this, and I wanted to apply it somewhere. Something long form, something with some meat to it that people could actually get their hands on instead of just seeing and forgetting a couple of seconds later. I wanted something with substance. Initially, my idea was to do something long form graphically or narratively, like write a fantasy novel or make a comic out of it. All the way back in October of 21, I did a 20-pager Firelock fantasy comics and Black Powder stuff. But I felt pretty intimidated by these mediums. I was used to, by dint of doing a lot of art and very short little associated lore snippets with them, to short form entries. And I felt that I didn't really have it in me to do something really long form yet. Around this time, around 2020, I got into the game Brigador by Stellar Jockeys. I will take this opportunity to shamelessly plug it. If you haven't already, go play that shit. It's fantastic. I was taken by the presentation.
I played it as well. It's goated. It's goated. You gotta give it a try, okay? It's pretty good.
Mm-hmm. I was taken by the presentation of Brigador, where they have this elaborate acquisitions and lore section to the game that's built into selecting your mech, equipping it with a weapon, etc. the enemy index that so many other games have, where they present not only what is mechanically interesting, this is what this mech does, this is what this cannon does, etc., but they use those boxes to paint broad strokes pictures about the setting as a whole and the human element, the thing that makes all of these military toys interesting. Things like, okay, this enemy that is like a spotter that moves around on a tread, that's basically useless as a weapon. It's not interesting as like a combatant. Its whole entry is given over to like 3 paragraphs on how it's been used as a mobile vaccination clinic or as a punishment posting to shitty drivers, and how the guys who tool them around mostly just end up smoking on the back deck, passing out candy to kids, etc. And it struck me that this short form mode of presentation was how I should go about doing my world building. It seemed to fit like a glove to what I wanted to do. So I decided, all right, I should make a game out of this. That's how it's going to be. Obviously, not in my skill sets to make a video game, so I looked into tabletop instead. I imagine that's... I don't want to sound like disrespectful to the medium by saying that, but ultimately, by happenstance, I blundered into making a tabletop war game as my method of presentation, and I found that it fit well enough that ever since I haven't really looked back.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's... and I don't mean this in a disrespectful manner, I think it's a little crazy to go, I don't have the skill set to make a video game. I'm going to make a tabletop war game with 5 books and 2 more planned and a full release. That'll show me. I can certainly do that, but a video game? No siree. That's a little too much work.
I have nothing but respect for people that actually go and make indie video games, like sit down and go the distance, but that's a matter of great technical execution. Like, you need the skill set, you need the discipline to just sit down and make that, chase bugs for years on end. Tabletop games are similar in many ways. They're essentially piles of mechanics that define like abstract behaviors, but you can create them just by putting them down to paper, which obviously is considerably easier. You can skip straight to, I would say, like the upper brain part of execution, which appealed to me since I wanted to make something that people could play and get to playing straight away, regardless of the ultimate medium. It just ended up fitting my needs best.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. No, that's really interesting though, that you had been exploring this, for lack of a better term, you've been exploring this space for a while, looking for a way to get it to paper. I've talked about this extensively on stream, that I love Firelock the game, but the thing that truly pulls me into, the thing that makes me want to play it more and more every time, that I'm so excited for the release of more books, the release of more lore and things like that, is the writing blurbs that are present throughout all of the books, right? And so to hear that you had considered at one point writing a fantasy novel or a short form comic, or had started work on these things, is interesting to me, mainly because I've often said on stream when playing that, or even when going through the books, man, if he just wrote a book, I would buy every copy.
Oh, thank you.
Because the book is full. These lore blurbs are, these blurbs, I don't want to call them lore blurbs, because they're not really. They're more than that. They're characterization for the factions. And Rayleigh Irving is one of my favorite characters I've ever read, just because of how he talks throughout all of them. Basically, I just wanted to elaborate on that and say that I think it's interesting that you had considered or explored these other options before deciding on making it a tabletop war game, because I had written down as a question for the interview if we would ever see the world of Firelock in a format other than the war game, and I think this is a perfect Segue, do you think that's still a possibility, or do you think that right now Firelock as a war game is what you're focused on for the foreseeable future?
So I conceive of Firelock because obviously I've been privy to it since it was just some dumb fantasy shit rattling around in my head with no connection to anything. I still think of it as kind of a big tent setting, as something I can apply to different, like, concrete results, a book or a game or whatnot. And it's something that I'd like to continue working on for a very long time. I don't. Some people make a new world, make a new setting for every creative project that they do. I think that I'm just going to keep coming back to Firelock, exploring different aspects, different parts of that world.
Yeah.
Right now, aside from stuff that'll be coming into the game proper with its release, I've got some long form writing on the back burner,
Right.
some stuff unrelated to 1980X, older fantasy material for the setting. I've got in mind some very long term, like ambitious projects that, frankly, I feel embarrassed talking about it because it's like pie in the sky. Years and years from now, I'd like to make a video game about it or two, different stuff than the ground warfare that the tabletop game focuses on. Frankly, my mind has been on submarine simulators like Cold Waters and Silent Hunter for the longest time, but that is something that I feel should be addressed when it comes to it. I'm a little bit self-conscious about discussing like pure ideas that are unformed, if that makes sense. I like being able to present something with some meat, something that's been realized at least partially when I discuss my ambitions.
No,
And apart
absolutely.
from all of that, I don't think I'll ever stop making various like disconnected art and short entries in the setting
Yeah.
about this and that when the mood strikes me.
No, absolutely, and I think it makes total sense to not want to put the cart before the horse in this sense, right? Because of you don't want your game that you have put real work into and have had tangible success and tangible results in. You don't want it to suddenly become an idea pie where it's like, well, I've got this idea. Yeah, well, I've got this idea, and that's all anybody talks about is the ideas and not what you actually currently have. Um,
Mhm.
because that can be very frustrating for anyone who does anything creatively that is large or has a world that you like people to explore. Is they get focused on the idea of what's next for the world, or they get focused on the idea of what has come before in the world, and they don't focus on the world that you are actually presenting in the now. Or at least personally, I don't want to say it's frustrating for you. For me personally, it is frustrating, but the only experience I have with that is various campaigns that I have run in tabletop settings that my community has asked me about, or things along those nature, right? I don't want to
Yeah, certainly.
even pretend to say that they are the same thing to this war game and this world that you have built, because they are not. I obviously did not ever put as much time into them, but the basis of that frustration, I think, is still similar.
Mhm. It's a matter of scope as far as I see it. What you're presenting has to be meaningful to the medium in which you present it. So, Firelock is a war game. Of course, the overwhelming majority of the material I give is going to be related to stuff that's valuable on the tabletop: military units, tactics, the psychology and beliefs of your fighting men, the civilian milieu in which they're sunk. Before the game is released, before we hit 1.0, something that I've been busy on in the background is a CIA World Atlas style civilian side lore book, just to provide further grounding for what the world of Firelock is like and kind of why these factions fight, what are their motivations, what are their cultures and peoples like, which I consider to be important for the military side of it to have any sort of significant grounding. I mean this strictly from the thematic sense, the artistic sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I'm repeating
no,
the same fucking
absolutely.
word.
Well,
Because of course the game, like, just as a pile of mechanics, that's the other half. It has to stand on its own and be enjoyable to play. And I feel like, especially given the like very hard and determined work of my collaborators, they and I have made a good rule set, and I'm very happy at how it's turned out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hummed and hawed about putting this question into the interview, but you kind of touched on it very briefly here, by talking about this uh, dossier, you called it, of like the various factions and why they fight. Throughout the different books, there is a level of ambiguity or uncertainty because they are written from the perspective of a federal intelligence officer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not all of them, but the majority of the blurbs are, which is why there is a lot of not even necessarily conflicting information, but there is a lack of information. Do you worry that the ambiguity in Firelock, if you remove too much of it, the world might lose some of its charm? Because there's ambiguity, at least as far as again the character of the federal intelligence officer is concerned, about how much autonomy the constructs in the Rygalic host actually have. There's ambiguity about whether or not the skeletal wolf king is actually talking to his white gloves, or if they're just like propagandizing that he is.
Mm-hmm.
And
So yes,
things along that nature.
absolutely. This is something that is like at the forefront for me whenever I'm. It's painting with broad strokes, essentially. I don't want to do to the setting what's a good example? The Horus Heresy books did for Warhammer, where they
Yeah,
just took all of this fascinating background stuff that your mind was invited to fill in and hammered it out in a way that was still interesting in its own right, mind, but which effectively collapsed that possibility space. A friend of mine a while back once said that he overwhelmingly preferred writing to visual art, even though he did both, because different people could look at the same length of text and create completely different images for it in their head. Whereas a picture can only be, you can interpret it in different ways, but you can only see it in one way, if that makes sense.
yeah,
And that's something that I do think of when writing Firelock. Going back to what I said about scope, I like it when answering a question opens three more questions. I don't like tying off loose ends,
right.
but I also have to be conscious of what and how I'm presenting. Using the Brigador approach again of attributing all of the lore to in universe sources with their own biases and perspectives helps because I can kind of double the information that I'm putting out per entry. Ray
Yeah,
Irving discussing this or that about Dogface Light Infantry, for example, is both him talking about the thing and, in some extent, talking about himself and the Federation. And for that CIA World Atlas, the fact book is what I've been calling it. This civilian lore compendium, I've been using the same approach. It'll have some World Atlas style like nerd info pages where I talk about population, industry, etc., in a very dry sense, just to set the mood. But then the
yeah,
rest is piles upon piles of quote unquote first person entries in the same style as the army books from a bunch of different perspectives. And the objective there is to keep painting this picture while avoiding accidentally enclosing it, leaving space for the mind to wander, for you to insert your dudes, so on and so forth. Just setting out a fertile ground for that, essentially.
yeah, absolutely. Sorry, someone started talking about Rygo supremacy, 55 million dead, Santagarians at Baba Kanet, and it made me laugh.
It
Um,
is instantly surreal to me to see the amount of positive feedback and memes and like level of enjoyment people have for the game. I think to some extent it still registers to me as my dumb little like personal project, and so I'm just blown away seeing little things like that. Like I can't thank the community enough for
well, I think
looking at
that
the script and enjoying
speaking
it.
speaking personally, you've made something really fun, and when something is fun, people like to enjoy it and talk about it. But talking more about the ambiguity for a second, is there anything as it currently stands that you think is too ambiguous, or that you would like to answer? Perhaps you erred too far into the side of ambiguity, or do you think that where things sit right now, other than the World Facts Atlas and stuff like that, you're pretty happy with the direction things have gone in Firelock?
I'm quite happy with the direction of the world building. Like the whole game, frankly, like the mechanical side has been progressing very smoothly as well. Again, thanks to the efforts of the rest of the Dreckfort, they've been pulling their weight very heavily.
Right.
Uh, but strictly the world building side of things, no, I think that what I have in the army books is pretty watertight. The World Atlas will be an expansion to that, essentially, just more ground to present some things discussed in the army books, but the idea is that those have enough civilian side stuff. Like what's on stream right now, this image of a block raid in the Ebon Forest by internal security. There will be much more about that kind of thing in the Atlas. I've already written some entries for their section of the book, but enough is communicated in the army book to sort of give you a basic grounding of who this faction is and a little bit of what it's like at home. Just enough to color and characterize your fighting men.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a favorite piece of ambiguity? Something that is like your favorite, like a little pet mystery that you're like, oh, I really like this one.
Uh, that's like saying who's your favorite child, to be honest. I really can't answer that one, but one of the ones that comes up very often in the Firelock threads, channels on Stellar Jockeys, Discord server we're posting all of this out of. The Brigador devs, actually, they're nothing if not gracious.
Gnome's a damn patriot. Yeah, that's the chat knows that one's my favorite. Is the conversation between the two federal aviation officers? Because I saw it. I saw that damn gnome. Gnome's a damn patriot.
Just the hubbub around the master brain, what it was, what its intents were, what its internal processes like. Was it sentient, so on and so forth? What the nature of its final communications were? People seem to never tire of that, and I find it really funny. Like, again, the surrealness of seeing this thing, this setting, this game become self-sustaining in a sense, and constantly attracting this kind of discourse from this thing that I and my friends have made. That just blows me away. Like, I can never get tired of it.
No, absolutely. And rightfully so. You've made a very interesting world. The gnome one is obviously is my favorite. It's my favorite conversation I think that happens in any of the books, just because it's very grounded and real, but it's also very funny. I think my favorite question or ambiguity in the series of books is the way the loopers talk about themselves. Because there is a blurb. I don't recall what book it is in. It might even be the Looper book, but for some reason I think it's the Santa Green book. But there's a blurb about never forget that you're a man. Don't ignore the fur, ignore the claws, or those are not claws,
That's
those
on
are
the-
hands.
It is in the Even Force book. It's on the Iron Pelts in Chapter 7, who are one of the scenario units that just came in with 0.9.5.
But I loved that lore blurb. Just for whatever reason, it really spoke to me, and I really, really enjoyed it.
So that's, again, the more stuff that I plan to cover at further length in the World Atlas, but that touches on one of the basic thematic impulses that I do when I write Lupar. Voice-wise, I take after various stuff, a little pathologic, a little All Quiet on the Western Front. That's Remark's voice is the source for a lot of Garanwi's entries, but this entry here concerning never forgetting who you actually are, for me, the Lupar, what makes them interesting is the fact that they were. at one point normal human beings. And
Sorry,
that
they were.
I thought that was clear enough in the book. But again, like the kind of things
Hey,
that's
it
another
probably
interesting
was, but
process.
I can't read, so you got to give me a break. Sometimes,
Sure.
this will be a revelation for me. Is again, I can't read.
It's things like that that further drive me to write the World Atlas, to cover things that were not within the scope of the Army book. Like some community members, they made a Firelock wiki, and they've been very dutiful in trying to assemble all of the insane shit that I say on Discord. But it pains me to see the sources be like random Discord links. I'd like it to all be centered in one place to
Yeah.
give like a good top-down look at the setting. But I digress. So
Page 40.
the notion with this entry is they were human beings. They're standing at the precipice of sliding further into like subhuman mutated animal savagery to become like demons of the woods, skinwalkers, if you will.
You know what?
And
I not to
their whole
interrupt
culture
you,
is
but I did just go read page 40. It's absolutely clear. I just, for whatever reason, have either never read this or read it and pushed it out of my mind. But this is so crystal clear, it's insane that I reacted with shock.
oh, there you have it. Yeah, like say another thing that I never get tired of, which always surprises me. People read entries that I wrote months or years ago, or react to images like art in the books with just as much verve, with just as much positivity and interest and willingness to dig in and like see the whole thing top to bottom as they did when I just put those out the door. Absolutely mainline that stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like I was saying, the notion with the Lupar is that they were humans. They stand at risk of no longer being human. They're already fucked up and animalistic and disgusting in a way. And their whole culture is bent around stopping that downslide, standing at the gates to the void and like digging your feet in, even if you can't take any further steps back. So I imagine that this might be somewhat unconscious and just like traditional and spiritual at the lower level, but in higher crust society for them, it would represent itself in this like ancient regime French style etiquette to do with how you should carry yourself and how you should refer to yourself. This character who speaks this entry in the Iron Pelts page, Rueliden, he is in a couple other entries in their book. He is a jet pilot, someone of fairly good standing from Lupar high society. And so I wanted to have him describe the kind of things that he might have been privy to himself in his upbringing. The notion that like every time you would refer to yourself as having paws or a snout or fur instead of a pelt, as if it's like something you're wearing, you get whacked on the nose until it's second nature to think of yourself as a human being playing the part of a monster and always being conscious of playing that part.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I digress. I imagine that you want to get back to what's on the docket.
I honestly was just trying to, I guess, find a good segue, but that's as good as any. Um, and I am genuinely curious. We talked about it very briefly in the like pre-interview chit chat where we did some testing and just make sure everything worked. But with you having released Santagria and the Regala Coast books, what's next on the docket for Firelock? Obviously, you've talked at least fairly extensively in this interview and even outside of it that 1.0 is next. But what does that mean? Like, what shape does that take?
So to me, 1.0 includes the CIA World Atlas, the civilian lore book. It'll include a good deal of final polishing, proofreading, and mechanical checking out. We're busy testing some new core mechanics right now, things to do with fixed wing aircraft and making their interactions more interesting. And our mindset, the Direct Fort and I, is that nothing mechanically is set in stone before release.
Hmm.
There's nothing that's sacred per se. If the game is made better by changing it after like an exhaustive round of playtesting, then we're willing to change it. When we're satisfied with all of that, which fortunately we don't have a lot to really consider because the game is just about come together as is,
Yeah.
then 1.0 will arrive in all of its pomp and circumstance. I have been considering a developer's commentary in like the Valve commentary node sense, where my collaborators and I sit down and just talk about different parts of making the game as a resource to someone who might want to make one in the future or to explain the spirit behind this or that rule, so on and so forth. I don't consider that entirely crucial. If people are like bashing down my door saying release the game or I'll kill you, I'm not going to push out the dev commentary with it, but it's something I'd like to get done. It's I consider it as like signing the product, if that makes sense, closing the work of art.
No, that makes
After
sense.
1.0, I would like to do a newsletter with things like new scenarios, short form entries, showcasing like small games that developers and friends have made, that kind of thing, just related interest matter. And as I've described in the Discord before, I have plans for two further entire army books that I have been working on small, like incrementally, as a break from the main thrust of the game.
Yeah.
But I'm not allowing myself to do any actual artwork with no ink whatsoever until 1.0 is done, just so that that can actually be finished within a reasonable time frame.
Yeah.
Now,
You
what the
don't want
time
to.
frame is, God knows what. Like I've been saying when it's done, but
Yeah.
hopefully that shouldn't be too long.
You don't want to get caught up in like a, well, 1.0 could come out now, but I've got all this artwork for this, sixth army. Maybe I should just wait until the army's done. And then if I do the sixth, maybe I should just wait until the seventh, because I could do that one pretty quick,
Mhm.
I think.
Like I said, I think I can do Firelock, whether that's 1980X the war game or Firelock the setting forever. I mean, until the day I die. But with that comes the impulse that I can just keep polishing this thing before pushing it out the door eternally. So at some point I have to say, like the line from Dune, like cut it off with a knife and say it's over because it ends here.
Someone in chat is curious, do you do all the artwork, or is that, partly you, partly the collaborators, or for the most part, is it all you?
So if you look in the core rules, in the scenarios that are provided at the bottom of the appendices, all of the unit patches and other graphic design, those are the work of my collaborator Score Goblin. He does an exceptionally good job with them. Uh, a lot of the MS Paint standees are either touched up, originally made, most like helicopters, fixed wing aircraft, and the like, by Dan, another of my collaborators. And map work has been from a range of people, plus C has been indispensable for that in particular. As for the rest, for the inked art, every single one of those is mine.
Okay. So there you go, Jeff. There's the answer to that question. Um, is there anything that this is kind of the facet of the game that never made the cut? Is there anything like that that you, with the 1.0 release, you would like to try to work back into being a part of the game, or any rule that you've had previously, any mechanic that you've had previously, you're like, this just doesn't work, and I don't have the time to make it work, that you want to revisit, anything like that?
So I have two answers for that actually. And in both of them, the case is no, I would not like to return to that for the game as is. Uh, Originally, I mentioned that when I got into making Firelock as a tabletop game, back then I had no collaborators. I was doing all of this shit by ear entirely on my own. All of the basic rules are my work, etc., the roster, so on. But that itself was kind of a second draft for the game as a whole.
Okay.
Originally, I was very heavily inspired by a Zachtronics game, a video game, Mobius Front 83. I don't know if you've played it. It's a turn based hex war game about mid 80s combat between America and evil parallel universe America. Long story. But I was very taken by that game, and my first mindset idea was I should essentially make a tabletop port of this. And I did. It was incredibly slick, it was drum tight. The whole core rules fit into 4 pages. And the
Mhm.
rosters weren't all that longer,
Yeah.
but I was dissatisfied from it from an artistic perspective. This being a hex war game, which was like 32 by 32 hexes or something on the map, your units were microscopic and mechanically they were very indistinct from each other. The difference between States Grenadiers, the 10-point Federal Infantry units, and Chasseurs, the 10-point Lupar Infantry units, which are fairly night and day in Firelock as it is today, back then boiled down to +1 HP on the Lupar's part, which obviously was a waste of the premise of fantasy warfare. I wanted individual units to be more interesting and more comprehensive and more immersive than they were in that iteration. So I junked the whole thing, went for a gridless and more freeform rule set, taking after a couple of different war games that I'd seen. A little bit of Age of Sigmar here, a little bit of Live Free or Die there, and I
Hmm.
never looked back. As for things that apply to Firelock as we know it today, a long time ago, in addition to fixed wing aircraft, which the game initially didn't have, but which ended up earning their place in the rules, I wanted there to be an entire space warfare minigame where you could bring spy satellites, armed capsules, or combat astronauts, depending on the faction, surface to space missiles fired by like outerlying warships or aircraft, so on and so forth. And the notion was that these were arrayed in a rock paper scissors system where one card could defeat the other and ultimately affect the table in some way.
Hmm.
This was tested and it ended up being axed altogether because ultimately it just didn't really fit the game. Not thematically, but mechanically, it was some completely unrelated sideshow that didn't affect the table whatsoever. It only boiled down to can I get the spy satellite to fly over the table where I want it to or not? After a bunch of rock, paper, scissors in the background between units that otherwise didn't affect anything.
Yeah. 1980X Space War, yeah. And I could see that being a problem too, because if you make the units in space too powerful, it's like, oh well, my army doesn't matter. I lost the rock paper scissors. I lose now. Or it's like, well, I won the rock paper scissors, but I don't get any benefit. You know.
Yeah,
Um.
there were fairly low fantasy spacecraft, if that makes sense. Like essentially armed Apollo era stuff,
Mhm.
capsules, spy satellites, so on. I didn't want something to be too zany and sci-fi. There's a remnant of this system in the loop book, actually. I want to say like somewhere around chapter 6. There's a drawing, a grayscale one, of a Federal and a Lupar astronaut in a melee with like fire axes and sidearms. And that was drawn with the intent of that being flavor art for the Lupar space warfare units, which was, they were called Espeteers. I'm probably mangling that pronunciation. Took it off of atomic rockets, but they were essentially there to raid and steal enemy space installations because they didn't have much ability, the Human Force being poor, to launch a lot of their own infrastructure into space.
Yeah.
But even though space warfare as a mechanic was axed, the game ultimately, like rule one, it has to be fun. It has to work. Even if something is cool, if it's shit to play, there's no sense in having it. even though I axed them all together as a unit, I thought the drawing was cool enough to retain it in the book and to provide a little bit of like unexplained broad strokes inspiration as to what might be happening in space above your forces.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the federal with the revolver. It ain't helping you here, buddy. He's already got you.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no,
That's a further ground for exploration in the future. Some of my collaborators have had their eyes on that, but again, I don't want to discuss things that aren't realized yet. So
things that may not
you'll
be.
hear from it when you hear from it.
Oh, yeah, yeah, makes sense. So what's I guess in the same vein, what's something you're looking forward to do with Firelock, and any of the future editions, or something that you're excited about? You know, if you don't have anything, that's fine. I know you said you don't want to talk too much about things that may not be, but is there anything you're like, this is pretty much guaranteed to happen from the testing we've done, or anything like that?
Mm-hmm. So for 1980X, like the wargame proper, God knows what will happen in a few years. Right now, I have no real plans for a second edition or anything of that stripe.
Yeah.
Once 1.0 hits, I think that we'll just create more scenarios, more art, the next two army books. I don't want to drown it under a million like cancerous additional splats, if that makes sense. But I'd like there to be a huge wealth of maps and scenarios and so on that people can play with and use as resources for their own work, just by dint of like slowly accruing these over time, making them as they seem interesting. And in the background right now, I've been workshopping a couple. As for the setting itself, I'd like to cover some different eras on the tabletop proper, not just 1980X. For me, the biggest and most significant one is what I've been calling Firelock fantasy. In like this reductive 1980X to 40K, what Firelock fantasy is to Warhammer fantasy, not different universes, but eras of the same setting. Firelock started, and this may come as a surprise to some people who play it, entirely. It had nothing to do with the 80s. It had nothing to do with the Cold War. It was, and frankly to me still is in my heart, a black powder setting about pike, shots, and cannon.
Yeah.
And I'd like to go back to that and write rules for combat and army building with the same races, the same factions, but earlier in their history and with that level of technology. Essentially, I'd like to do to 1690, like the turn of the century, the turn of Marlborough's day, what I did for the early 80s with Firelock 1980X.
That is interesting. I knew that. Excuse me. I knew that you had done or had started it as a black powder setting. You've talked about that before on your Twitter page, as well as most recently, I think, on your Patreon. You had made a post about it. Support Rifleinfantry on Patreon if you don't and you like the game. But I didn't know that was something you were so interested in exploring, for lack of a better statement, I guess, if that makes sense. I didn't know that you had wanted to so clearly go back to it. So that's interesting.
Not to say that I want to can 1980X, certainly not. That's something I expect to come back to for a long time.
No, absolutely. No, I didn't mean to imply that.
Essentially, yeah, it started as like a fun diversion from the black powder setting that quickly grew to massively eclipse it by dint of having a war game around it that was worth playing. It had something of substance that it could put down roots into. And I'd like to do the same for the black powder era of Firelock.
Absolutely. So, sorry, give me just 1 second. So I know that spiritualism is a theme in the book, or at least for the Looper book, right? But for a setting called, Nuclear War in the Fantasy Age, we haven't seen a lot of what you might call, like, fantasy magic. Is that ever something that Firelock might explore, or?
So I do not think Firelock is the kind of setting that has like wizards casting magic missile and
Mhm.
shit like that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff that inspires it. It's something of a summation of all of my fictional, military, thematic, aesthetic interests. A little bit of a kitchen sink in that respect. But generally, it's in the same like low fantasy magical realism milieu as a lot of mythology and older war memoirs. The Short Timers by Gustav Hasford, the book that Full Metal Jacket is a movie adaptation of, is a very heavy inspiration for me. The notion of the Vietnam War as this like strange, surreal, mythological world in almost the same vein to me as like not classical. This is something where Score could step in. He knows the terminology here, but it's in the same register to me as like Beowulf or the Song of Roland. I wanted to do with Firelock the treatments to the battle rifle, to the FNFAL, what those works did to the spear and the shield.
Okay.
Because like something that I always think of when I think of the register of Firelock is the Normans at Hastings, if I remember that matchup right, chanting the Song of Roland, which is a story about a guy that splits a mountain in two with a sword and lances Saracens so hard that they explode to psych themselves up before the shield walls clashed. And to them, that was a story about the same technology. It was a fantasy story, but it was a story about men on horseback, men with spear and shield and axe and bow and so on. Very recognizable things to them. I think today it's very popular to portray this like tradition versus modernity, magic versus technology split.
Uh-huh.
But I don't really do that with Firelock. To me, the rifle and the ammo pouch and the helmet are magical items in the same way that a Spangen helm and a cavalry lance are, if that makes sense. And that's the treatment I try to give them in the writing.
No, to be honest, you had kind of lost me until that last statement there, where I think that does kind of make the most sense to me, right? It's not modernity versus magic. It's modernity is magic, and if that makes any sense, that might not be exactly what you mean, but that's how it came across to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the setting comes across is that um, it's these weapons that they use are their like fantasy magical tools. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. The notion that these things are worthy of, in their own way, the same respect, dignity, and mystique, particularly as what you see in old heroic tales and mythology. That's the read I got out of the Short Timers and books like it, and it's the register that I kind of parrot for writing Firelock.
No, absolutely. Um, I guess in that same vein of not ever going to see, I guess what you might call even low magic in Firelock. Do you think that we might ever see what people would consider magical creatures, kind of realized in the world of Firelock? I know that obviously people call, at least in my community, people call the Regalic host, the constructs, kind of like a take on space elves, but without the magic. And I know in the federal book, or maybe even the core book, there's a map that shows some of the outlying lands. And one of them is the Ogre Kingdoms, which I am personally, even if they show up in like a mercenary splat or something you can add to your armies, I love ogres. That's what I have been personally most excited to see anything of, and if it never comes, it never comes. But would there ever be anything like that, an army group or a race of gnomes that are not magical, but kind of take a magical race's form?
So I try to attribute these things to the factions already as they exist.
Mhm.
Firelock, to go way back to like the first question, honestly, when it started, I was in high school still. I'm not all that decrepit yet. It started as really dreadful, like D&D Tolkien ripoff schlock. It had dwarfs, it had elves, it had orcs, and over time, I realized, okay, these are the things that I like about these creatures that I want to retain, these specific aesthetic or thematic elements. And these are the ones that I'm just integrating to check off boxes because fantasy has to have dwarfs and shit. And you can see some of the legacy of that in the factions as they are today. The Lupar fill a little bit of the orc role as the conscious, tragic, and noble savages, or destructive and cannibalistic horde, depending on who you are, like which side of the firing line you're on.
Yeah.
Uh, the Federals are heavily bearded, constantly drunk, stubborn, semi traditionalist lovers of smoke and the vitality of the machine,
Mhm.
which they don't need to be 4 feet tall to communicate the elements there.
No,
And then the
absolutely. No,
rebels
yeah.
obviously are the settings elves. And they grew into a weird mechanical Apollo program direction over time just because that was what I was interested in portraying with them. So as for like I call them marginalia, like fantasy creatures, this splash piece that you're seeing on right now in the loop book is a good example of how I like to portray them. There are mushrooms there with eyes regarding judging but not speaking what they're looking at. And I imagine that the world is rife with that. It's something I want to portray in the illustrations of the fact book of the civilian lore atlas. There's some entries there on gnomes as well. So if you'll enjoy those, you'll get your fill of them.
Hey, as long as they're federal patriots, that's all I care about. That gnome's a goddamn patriot.
As you know it. But yeah, like I portray them as a component of the world rather than as something separate from it. In the sense of like you go over the hill in mythology and there are some creatures there that might kill you or might come to terms with you and they're just part of the world in the same way that the humans living in it are. They're not in this deliberately like artificial separated sense that I think a lot of fantasy tries to portray now.
Yeah. No, that's. I like the take here on the elements of these fantasy races, right, being incorporated into these, I guess, non-standard kind of versions of themselves. Like the Federals being very, dwarven-esque, but they're not small, right? But they still have these dwarven elements to them. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the Loopers being these kind of Loopers being cursed beings, right? But it's not explicitly clear, is it magical? Is it a mutation from the nuclear fallout? Or at least it's not clear to me, but
Mm-hmm.
as you know, I can't read and
I'd
I
say
didn't.
it's not. That's something I should probably make clear. They've been around for quite some while. Within written recollection, like 40 generations, but they well predate the nuclear conflict that backlines some of the setting. That too will be mentioned more in the Atlas, and it is described some such in the Santee book right now. It's just the 36 Years' War that's brought up several times.
Mhm. That's a good point. Someone in chat pointed out that in-universe characters would find them unremarkable, but us outside of the setting would find these things to be magical.
Precisely, and that's the energy I go with them. Like,
Excuse me.
Beowulf doesn't yick out when Grendel is followed up by Grendel's mother. Like, that's to be expected,
And he goes,
basically. It's
yes,
a
of
component of this
course.
world.
That makes complete sense to me. No, absolutely. Um, Yeah, man, it's just so interesting to me. Sorry, because I'm only just now realizing that there are all of these traits, right? These traits of different fantasy races attributed to the armies that I've never picked up on, just because viewing them as a whole to me makes so much sense that I don't pick apart what makes them, I guess, what makes them that whole, right? I haven't picked them apart piece by piece and seen these individualistic character traits on their own, that makes them so unique, and realize they come from other things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just thinking about that for a minute, because it's even more interesting also to know that the loopers have been like that long before the nuclear conflict, because it's also, at least implied, and I don't know how much you want to talk about anything like this, but it's implied that at one point the skeletal wolf king was openly communicating with the people of his nation, with the other loopers, and whether or not that's magical or its own thing, or if the curse, that's all very interesting to me, because science is, at least in the world of Firelock, is very real, right? Like the master brain was a real technological construct that at the very least everyone agrees existed, even if they don't know where it came from or what it did exactly,
Mm-hmm.
other than run the Rigolic Empire and keep the food trains running and keep people fed. They may not have known everything it did, and there's also facets of space exploration. I mean, hell, you have the Santagrians using the X-Tow, which is literally a spaceship turned on its side with some wheels attached.
It's built out of bits and pieces of Project Gemini stuff from real life, early NASA machinery, a Titan II missile with a little bit of a NASA pad crawler that it's been bolted onto, one of the 4 track units. That was one of my favorite designs to make myself.
Santagria is weird because they're the last bastion of Ood's weirdness. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the world's name correctly. Feel free to, if I say anything wrong, feel free to correct me. Obviously, the
Mm-hmm.
majority of this I have read, and not heard other people speak it out
The new
loud. So,
world is Oid.
Oid. Okay, there you go.
One of my favorite suffixes. It's similar in some. I guess it's like I never played Ace Combat. Frankly, I'm not terribly interested in doing it. But the way that they call their setting Strange Real as a nod to Earth, but distinct in its own way.
Mm-hmm.
Oid has recognizable features, but they're shifted through this fantasy lens,
Yeah,
and they acquire some novelty throughout.
and I think the world does a good job of keeping the novelty for us as viewers of the world, but making everything feel like part of the day to day for the characters that are talking about it, right? You're not gonna have a character from uh, Santagria be like, "Oh my god, the islands are floating." They're like, "My brother fell off a floating island." What are you gonna do? Like for them, that's everyday stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the book does a really good job of just talking about the things like that in a way that the characters would naturally do so, while still allowing the player or the reader to, for lack of a better term, understand the whimsy behind it.
Yeah.
Um, out of out of that, I guess we'll move on to kind of the next question, which is one that we talked about again briefly in the pre-interview that you were excited to talk about, which
Mm-hmm.
is that through playtesting or general play of everyone playing it, did the playtesters or players surprise you in any way? Using weird tactics, unorthodox ways of playing the game, something that you just rules as written didn't realize was even possible.
So this is something that originally I had a good answer for this written. I haven't been going off of a script freeze, but I was taking notes when I received the docket last night.
Mm-hmm.
In the middle of doing that, a better answer than I could ever have hoped to come up with myself popped out of a game that was running just that evening between a couple of players on Stellar Jockeys.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a Federal versus Santa Green match. The Santa Green player had some Atomic Pilgrims, who are, of course, a unit armed with the only on table nuclear weapons for ground forces in Firelock.
Yeah.
Essentially a Davy Crockett. So like nuclear recoilless rifle firing an atomic watermelon.
Yeah.
These guys were in a hidden position behind some trees, waiting for something to move beyond that to ambush it. Instead, a federal command tank comes bursting through said trees right into their front and enters into close combat, moves to within 50 meters. So previously, I had specifically exempted atomic pilgrims from the no CC special rule. That is, they were capable of firing the atomic weapon in close combat inside of 50 meters because I felt that was both insanely funny and thematically appropriate for them. They're worshippers of atomic explosions. Being vaporized by your own blast would be one of the coolest ways to go as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
And this is where something that I had not foreseen came up. Nuclear weapons have several radiuses attributed to them: fireball, overpressure, and thermal, representing their different effects. And the fireball is just an instant death radius. Anything caught in there is vaporized, no questions asked. Because of the small scale of their watermelon-sized nukes, these guys have one of the few 1-inch radiuses in the game. And the size of the bases was such that, depending on the place that they were technically aiming at in close combat, whether it was between the two units, because they're expected to meet in the middle, or exactly at the center of the attacker's base, an argument could be made that either A, both sides were vaporized by the blast, or B, that the tank was vaporized by the blast, but the atomic pilgrims stood an extremely narrow chance of surviving if they ate the overpressure, kill rolls, and the thermal radiation successfully with only their robes to protect them.
They could.
And the problem is that both of these were incredibly badass and were equally cool as outcomes. Even to the point of, like, since the fireball radius was so small, the real Davy Crockett was something like 20 meters total destruction off the top of my head. Theoretically, they could survive, even if only for the duration of the rest of the battle before keeling over from fatal radiation poisoning.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of back and forth between the players as to, well, very tongue-in-cheek, which of these outcomes would be more interesting. And that led to us internally having to consider what happens when weapons with a radius, which don't normally engage in close combat, do, and how that works, exactly where the aim point is for units engaged in close combat, in basal contact with one another. This is something that we never would have thought of in a million years if it didn't come up quite organically in one of the games.
Yeah. Can I ask what the end decision was there? If you had to step in and decide an indecision?
I'm pretty sure they went with mutual destruction at the time. I'd have to take a look at the channel again, but that is something we're still thinking of internally. This happened only just last night.
Mm-hmm. And that's so funny though, because
Mm-hmm.
I can just imagine, because it's the person I play the most Firelock with is in the chat. I can just imagine how angry he would be if I ran up, close CC, nuclear struck his truck, and then argued with him. No, I live, dude. No, look, measure the base. I walk away. You die.
Granted, it was like a 1 in a million chance for them to survive because they were still eating all of the thermal radiation and all of the overpressure from the blast, and they're like toughness 1-. But
no, absolutely.
Yeah, basically was going down to what made more sense and what was more badass. Immediate vaporization or reaching out and being able to touch the fireball, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. And you were asking earlier about representation of like magical creatures and marginalia in the books. Again, something I mean to expound on further in the World Atlas, but the splash you're on right now in the Santa Green book, those are walking buildings in the background. I think they're mentioned a couple of times.
They are. I was going to ask about them because someone in chat had brought them up as well. They had brought up that the Santa Green is one of the last few places of like what we would consider magic in the world, because not only do they have the walking buildings, they have the floating islands, and they pointed out that that apparently the Regalic host had shot down a bunch of the floating islands at one point.
So I never wrote anything like that. I think that there's a little bit of like part and parcel with writing in broad strokes and leaving so much space for people to draw their own conclusions is that sometimes they will draw their own conclusions in a way that other people then take as fact.
So there's a liar in my chat. You've been outed, and I'll remember your name.
Yeah, I know. You have to kill him with a fire axe.
I know who you are.
No, but in all seriousness, as I've described earlier, I think of the whole world as being a little wild and fantastical and magical and special in its own rights. Santagria is a focal point for that. No real special reason. It's just full of this kind of shit because it's appropriate to the character of the faction and the people. The idea behind the walking buildings is that when the nuclear war happened, obviously Santagria was the most heavily hit. They didn't have any defenses against it. They were kind of dogpiled by the other factions. And after the bomb stopped falling, as part of the general surrealism of that period and of the setting in general, a lot of these buildings, these cities, tore themselves up off of their foundations and walked away. And now they just sort of constantly amble about, the idea being that it makes them a harder target for nuclear strikes. They do this entirely on their own.
But they're not so funny.
They're not animals or anything like that. They're still buildings that fundamentally exist to serve man. So you can go into one, put up a generator, fix the windows. It'll be quite all right with it. I imagine that sometimes they'll try and solicit this kind of help. A steel mill will go into town to pick up people from the burbs that otherwise have no employment, and then it'll try to put itself next to a coal mine to receive the resources that it needs, and then at night it'll move off to a safe standoff so that they're not caught, these two industries together. And they're doing this entirely on their own, whether or not the people that built them would prefer that.
So two things back to back. I'll start with this one first. Do the living buildings have any sentience, or can we explore them a little bit, or is that not something you'd really like to touch on? I don't want to leave a little bit of ambiguity there.
I want to leave some ambiguity there, but I will say that they're not animals. They're not herd creatures. They're buildings. They just decided to start doing this on their own because clustered buildings, stationary buildings, are ripe targets for nuclear weapons.
Hey, if I got nuked as much as these guys did, I'd also grow some legs and get the fuck out of there, okay? I'd put my Lamborghinis on and I'd get the fuck out of there. So Otz asked in chat, this is funny because I asked you the same question, I worded it a little differently, and I'd like to revisit it because you gave a really good answer off of stream, so I'm sorry to make you repeat yourself, but he asked why the Appomattox doesn't get steel watch bands, and the reason you gave, very succinctly, was that the rules and various other rules in the books represent specific phenomenon present in real life or in real militaries. But can you explore that a little more using the Appomattox as an example?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to restate the answer that I gave. So, steel watch bands in the Federal Army book is a special rule representative of the kind of technical excellence and crew coordination that divides shitty tanks and good tank crews. So in real life, I'm a tanker with the National Guard. I work with these things. I know a thing or two about them. And you can see, if I go way back on my Twitter, before and after I shipped out and actually got hands-on with these things, there was a whole line of old illustrations for various tanks and personnel carriers in the books, and they were just fucking awful. Like, I cannot believe I ever drew them. When I came back, I was so disgusted by like these things being misshapen and out of proportion that I went back and elaborately redrew almost all of the vehicles in the army books that then existed, feds and loops, into what they are today. But I digress. Steel Watch Bands is representative of a crew that is well trained enough, well coordinated enough to pull off the kind of quick berm drills that we do in real life. Pop up behind your cover, fire your shots, move back down. And the driver there has to be on top of his game. He has to anticipate exactly when to start moving and when to stop, go up and down smoothly, like feathering the gas in the brake so that the gun is stable when it reaches its moment of firing, and so that the crew in the turrets, because obviously they have no seatbelts, aren't being thrown all over the place when the tank comes to a stop. You can't slam on the brakes. So it requires a lot of skill. It requires knowing, like, intuitively, even if you can't really see through your driver's periscopes, where to stop so that you're not having the gunner shoot the gun into the berm in front of him, giving him enough lift while not exposing the whole tank. You get the idea. It takes a lot of effort. And that's not something I attribute as standard to tanks and Firelock. The States Army gets it because this is their specialty. This is what they're excellent at. Again, in a very U.S. military style, writing what I know. And so units that either don't have that training, like your humdrum basic grumble crew members, or units that just don't do that mode of fighting to begin with, like the Appomattox, don't receive Steel Watch Bands. Where possible, I tie special rules and mechanics more generally as best as possible, given the unavoidable abstraction that a tabletop wargame is going to have compared to reality, to specific phenomenons.
Yeah.
I try to keep accuracy for a weapon related to its likeliness to score a hit, dice to how much light it's putting in the air, so on and so forth. And I deviate from this only begrudgingly. I think that the more you can tie individual mechanics in a war game to real things that are happening in this battle that you're simulating, the more intuitive and the more enjoyable that it is.
Is it true? The chat wants to know, is it true you joined the army to world build better?
No, but I would be lying if that wasn't
a really cool benefit.
Yeah. I'd be lying if I wasn't looking very much forward to actually working with tanks and getting a sense of the size and proportions and solidity and internal functions of these things to better the representation in the game, as well as like the general military milieu around them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we just have a few more questions here. And I do want to say, because we're on it now, it's one of my... it's not my favorite Rifleinfantry host artwork. My favorite is the one where the tank and the two constructs are looking at a bug. That's not shocking. I feel like that's everyone's favorite from this book. But I like this one a lot, which is the two constructs standing, seemingly guard at sandbags while one of them smokes a cigar. And I like this one a lot because there is a blurb about a federal soldier who goes up to the death line on the border and drops a cigar across. And that night there's a construct across the border or across the death line smoking it, and he's the only one. And the only reason I bring this up is because it's one of my favorites. I have a lot, if you couldn't tell from the way I talk about it, but it's one of my favorite pieces of Rifleinfantry ambiguity, which is how much autonomy these constructs have and why they do the things they do when the master brain isn't, or the remnants of the master brain or whoever is ordering them isn't telling them what to do, right? Because you have examples of them, doing things like smoking cigars. The more interesting one to me, though, is the one where they go and they dig up a bunch of federal graves and cut open their chests, only to then just leave them there because they don't see a place to plug in turbines. And it's like, why are they doing these things? Are they doing it because they want to help? Or are they doing these things because they think they can just plug it into what they view as alternative constructs and get them on side? It's very interesting. It's very interesting pieces of emotional ambiguity in the Rygalic story that is being told, and I very much like it.
Mm-hmm. So for this one in particular, yeah, the guy on the right, he's a old hand per se, like a construct that's been around the block. Some Lupar has yomped a good bit out of his forearm. He's all kinds of torn up, so on and so forth. And the cigar he's smoking, that's just a purely learned action. It's like the scene in Terminator 2 where Arnold is learning to smile, right? And he's doing it by looking at people smiling and then like iteratively tugging on each of his face muscles until he slowly puts it together. Just figure out like what's the shape of that. That's what I imagine these guys do. So the cigar, it doesn't do anything for him whatsoever. There's a cutaway elsewhere in the Rago book of the internals of a construct, where you can see that the rib cage is just empty. They have no lungs whatsoever, and the smoke is actually coming out of a hole that didn't fully crust over in him that just leads directly into his chest cavity. He probably took like a 50 cal there or some shit. And it's just a learned action. He sees that the Federals on the other side of the death line smoke cigars and lounge about, and he does this because it's the thing that he's learned to do. It seems appropriate to his situation. Constructs come out of the gate with the ability to speak, the ability to use and maintain their weapons, and nothing else. They're blank slates. They're like little kids, basically, in adult bodies. And so everything is in this like several month span they might exist before they're shot down, or however long they end up living, because that's only a function of how much fuel they have. Fill a dead one up, jolt it, and it'll come back to life. But they will build a model of the world over time based on the things that they've seen. And it's going to be a very strange and idiosyncratic model because they have none of those instincts, none of that like social grounding that human beings have throughout all of their upbringings.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting because that its learned behavior is intriguing to me, because, and I think I'm going to call this out a little bit. The second artwork, or my favorite artwork in the book, the one where they're looking at the bugs, one of the constructs is seemingly smiling while he looks at the bug. So saying that everything they do is learned behavior, and we know that in the main cities of the Rygalic Coast, they live and work around regular everyday citizens that aren't constructs, right? That they still take care of. The fact that this construct probably just spent time there in the like interlands and saw other people smiling and learned it from them is, I really like it. It's very cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the flip side of going back to what I said like an hour ago concerning that friend of mine who preferred the interpretability of writing to visual mediums. I disagree with him in that respect. I think that even if you see a picture in one way, you're going to fill it in. You're going to interpret it in a million different ways based on who's looking. And that's why I think the art of Firelock is the draw that it is. It's what gets people hooked, where the game actually being worth playing, the game being fun and slick and put together, is what retains people.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree. So I guess I'll kind of lead into this as one of our last questions, because I know what the last question is going to be. What is your favorite unit that you have made so far, if you have one? I know earlier you talked about how you have to pick your favorite child. Well, now I'm putting you on the spot. I'm asking you to do exactly that and reveal finally to everyone here, what is your actual favorite unit out of all of the books and armies?
I have astoundingly basic taste when it comes to Firelock units. I love all of them, but if I was going to pick my personal favorite, it would be Federal States Grenadiers.
Really?
Either that or Tusker Ks. Now, this isn't just because the Feds are an accumulation of kind of like the closest to heart aesthetic interests for me, but also because these were the two fundamental dipstick units of the game.
Yeah.
States Grenadiers were the infantry by which all other infantry were defined, and the Tusker K was the tank by which all other tanks were defined. I think it even says as much in its remarks entry. And from these two foundational units for the entirety of Firelock, the rest of, like, God knows, 160 something units in the game. I'd have to count again. Someone corrects me on that. All of the other units from all the other books sprung up in reference to these two. So they'll always hold like a very, very special place in my heart.
No, absolutely. Do you feel like, because having talked about this, and this might be too negative, so again, feel free to not answer this question. Do you have a least favorite unit, a unit that you think is in its current iteration not fitting where you want it to fit?
I wouldn't say so. Like if we have difficulties with a unit's mechanical balance, we change its stats or we reduce its price. Uh, Intermarine Rangers, for example, in the
Mm-hmm.
Federal book, their art was changed midway through their existence a little while ago to give them thermal sights because
Yeah.
they needed it to be useful as a unit, and previously they didn't have them. And I also changed their lore blurb recently to reevaluate the sort of rip-off Rygo antennae that they had implanted to better reflect the picture of the setting I had as of today, because they are one of the old Feds have a lot of very old unit entries. They're the first book to be written. By
Yeah.
and large, they make the cuts today, but these guys, I needed to emphasize that it's extremely experimental technology. The rejection rates suck. Like that Firelock is not sci-fi. It's by and large grounded in what was possible in the 80s or thought to be possible in the near future.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say overall, there's no unit that's I can't stand. I mean, if that was the case, it wouldn't be in the game.
Yeah.
Pretty much every single one of the units, barring a couple like pages in the Santee roster, are of my provenance, and they wouldn't be in the book if they hadn't first justified their existence.
Absolutely. Do you have a unit that you were shocked to see the community latch onto the way that they have?
The ones that pop up in community memes, like internal security, Black Fangs, atomic pilgrims,
Mm-hmm.
smart gum teams, and the like. There's some faction like standout units in each faction that people just glom onto straight away for either because they like the look of them or their themes, or because they're just one of the better units in that faction for all around mechanical utility.
Yeah. No, that's fair. Well then, I guess I will ask you to finally, um, what has inspired or is actively inspiring, the world of Firelock that makes you want to get up every day and add more to it? Is there anything? Because I know that most recently on your Patreon you talked about how you've been playing a lot of StarCraft, and you were, um, kind of doing some stuff around that. But is there anything like that, or has Firelock on the whole kind of grown to the point that Firelock inspires Firelock, if that makes sense?
I think it's definitely reached a self-sustaining point where I can look at existing Firelock material for further inspiration, but I don't like to do that unless I'm like checking for consistency, which is something that I constantly do. I I think I answered a lot of this question already. The inspirations include like all sorts of aesthetic stuff that I like about armed forces. They range across several centuries. I mix and match a lot by faction. The overall milieu is based on mythology and military surrealism, like more contemporary memoirs. And I try to be, it's hard to explain. Consistency is something I strive for with each faction, but I do it by gut rather than by real world association. It feels right for Lupar to wear German raindrop camo, even if they're not wholly based on the communist regime in East Germany, even if they have a lot of French and British stuff associated, or rather Meiji Japanese, like societal trend, some Soviets to their government structure. I could go on and on. Point is, Firelock is a collection of pretty much everything that I find interesting,
Yeah.
with enough ropes drawn around it to make it cohesive and slick and balanced to the same world. So I kind of struggle to break it down beyond what's visible in the books, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right. I already did ask you this question, which is cringe of me, but hey, you did a great job answering it again and providing more information, so I appreciate that. So the last question, I guess, that I want to leave off on, good and proper, is: do you have any plans, or are there any plans on a large scale release? You know, a physical large scale release, you know, publicly or privately funded, with the various books and standees or even minis, or do you not see something
We are
like that
discussing
happening?
this topic internally right now, but I'm not going to say a word about it until there's concrete plans.
No,
So,
absolutely. No, absolutely.
you know, whatever God deigns to send. As for the game itself, I have no intention of ever charging for Firelock, just being able to get into it. The PDFs will be free forever. The printable standees
Mm-hmm.
exist specifically so you can play it in real life without having to shell out for STLs or God knows what,
Yeah.
or expensive kit bashing. The idea is that theoretically you should be able to play the game with like a floor and the standees and some dice and rulers, which is something that I've done before on like a Motel 8.
Yeah. No, so fair. Thank you for answering the question, and I wanted to say, you know, thank you for coming on and talking about Firelock and talking about the game. Is there anything that we, you know, didn't get to cover or didn't get to talk about in the world of Firelock that you want to talk about before, uh, you know, the interview is over and we go our separate ways, never to speak again?
I'm sorry, I was just caught up by the crank turner in my basement screaming in agony. Would you repeat the last question?
I was going to ask if there was anything you wanted to talk about Firelock, or anything cool you wanted to plug before the interview is over. Anything we didn't get the chance to talk about or ask about that you want to, or just something about the world that you like specifically talking about you don't often get to.
I feel like I have quite the opportunity to flap my gums about this on a regular basis, and we're a half hour over, so I won't insist on any further diatribes on my part. I will say the Santi and Rago books, for anybody that doesn't know, were just recently released in their initial forms. All four of the 1.0 army books are now there and ready to play. So if you haven't touched those factions already, or if you haven't played the game in a hot minute and you're looking to get back in, now would be the time.
And remember, if you lose a match as the Ragalic host faster than 30 seconds, you're worse than me. And if you last longer than 30 seconds, you're better than me. But 30 seconds is the time to beat, chat. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to the stream today. For the people who regularly come to my streams, I will be live again probably in 30 minutes with just regular stream stuff. But for the people who were here just to watch the interview with Rifle Infantry, that portion is over. And thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you, Rifle Infantry, for coming onto the stream and talking about the game. I really do sincerely love playing it. I love reading the books. It's a ton of fun. And I recommend everyone in chat give it a try. The people on the Discord are very kind. They're very nice, and they weren't even too mean to me when I played the game wrong. So if you want to try it, chat, it's very easy to get into, and it's all free. So yeah, thank you guys for watching this stream, and for my regular viewers, I'll be back in like 30 minutes.